the imagination. Okay, sorry, now for the records. So, steering the imagination, anticipatory governance of speculative technologies. So, Aarti is professor of global environmental governance with the Environmental Policy Group at Wageningen University in the Netherlands. Her research focuses on global environmental and climate governance, including questions of transparency, accountability, and anticipatory and governance of novel technologies, for instance, climate engineering, biotechnology. And she has published extensively on these topics. Her book on transparency in global environmental governance, critical perspective, was published by MIT in 2014. She has many articles on that topic and others. At Wageningen, she coordinates the Governing Climate Futures research theme. She is the principal investigator of the transformative potential of climate transparency. It's called TransGov. It's a project that's affiliated to Earth System Governance. She co-leads the Reimagine Consortium project on anticipatory climate governance, but also she's a lead faculty of the Earth System Governance Research Network. She was one of the coordinating lead authors of the new Science Implementation Plan, really brought this idea of anticipation and imagination to the Science Plan. And she's also now part of the Scientific Steering Committee of their System Governance. I'm very pleased to work with her. She's very friendly, very sharp when needed, and I've learned a lot from her. So I'm really glad that she has taken some time to talk to all of us. Thank you so much, Aarti.
Thank you very much, Christina, also for that very kind introduction, for the kind words. I also enjoy very much working with you in the context of the Esg Scientific Steering Committee, of which you are also, of course, a member. And thank you, Jane and Gustav, also for organizing this and for inviting me to give this talk. And yes, I understand. I think it's a great initiative to have these ESG early career dialogues, a wonderful opportunity for members of our community to come together. So I hope you've had a very inspiring 2 days. I'm sure you have had. And I'm the last. So I hope that you have what I say resonates and in some way with what all you've been discussing so far. So as Christina said, the topic for this last session is steering the imagination, anticipatory governance of speculative technologies. So let me see, so why that title and why a focus on anticipation, anticipatory governance? Because of course, engaging with the future has become ever more central to sustainability governance, sustainability studies. And the key challenge is how to identify and govern ongoing Earth system transformations. So the governance challenge is increasingly anticipatory. It requires imagining diverse futures and then trying to steer towards those diverse futures. So it's not just ex post governance, something has happened, some sort of environmental damage, etc., and one is trying to ex post address that, but it's ex ante governance. And that is, of course, a significant challenge. And this challenge of anticipatory governance, how can you actually design governance arrangements in the present to steer towards what might be uncertain and contested futures? We thought this was important enough as a set of to include in what Christina also talked about, the new ESG Science Plan, which I hope many of you have had a chance to read. So it's a fun read, so please take a look at it if you haven't. But essentially, and some of you may be familiar with earlier ESG work, and we used to have various other A's. We used to talk about agents and architectures, allocation challenges, adaptation challenges, etc. in the previous iteration of the ESG Science Plan. And here we've now added another A. So the ESG network likes likes various A's, they are important. So this one is about anticipation. And we coupled it, as I said, anticipation being a set of tools and methods to imagine and steer towards the future, whether that's modeling or scenario building, foresight exercises, etc. But we coupled it here also with the notion of imagination, because of course, these tools of anticipation, they also implicate different visions of the future, different imaginaries of the future. So we wanted to add this research lens into the ESG research agenda for the next 10 years or more. And of course, it doesn't end in 2028, but this is something that we think is an important aspect of the ESG research agenda. So there is our science plan, but there's also within the ESG network, we also have a task force on anticipatory governance. I understood through glancing at the program that you had Joost Vervoort doing something. I don't know, it sounded like meditation, but I'm not sure if there was some element of his other work. With him, I co-set up this anticipatory governance task force. So I'm not sure he talked about that. But anyway, Joost is another person working on this. There's also a very active Slack community on anticipation and imagination that Joost runs from Utrecht University. So if you're interested in this topic, there's a lot happening within the ESG network. And so, as I said, this is one definition of anticipatory governance. We've also, in the context of our task force and my own research on this topic, we have together with in the Reimagine project, which Christina mentioned, where we look at anticipatory governance of climate futures in vulnerable regions of the global south. We also have, in that context, we have a PhD candidate, Caroline Mauderman, who's looked together with us at a whole range of ways in which different social science communities understand the notion of anticipatory governance. If you're interested in that, we've done an extensive review of how this notion is understood in different research communities. But one definition of anticipatory governance that I work with in my own work and together with Joost and Caroline is that it requires governance of potential future environmental changes or opportunities, risks and harms, including those posed by novel technologies. But in the face of extreme normative and scientific uncertainty and conflict, over the very existence and the nature and the distributive consequences of benefits and harms. So if there is this kind of fundamental normative and scientific uncertainty and conflict about the very object of governance, then that it's a significant challenge to devise governance arrangements in the present to address something that's the contours of which are not fully clear yet. So we find that in that sense, this is a challenge that the governance community actually we need to design governance in the present to deal with the future, but the effectiveness of governance arrangements, the legitimacy of governance arrangements are all challenging to secure. And furthermore, we think that one particular research gap is to look at processes of anticipation as actually a site of politics, because there are a lot of anticipation focused activities underway. There are the modeling exercises, as I said, there's a lot of foresight, scenario building, assessments, futuring techniques, but these are not just neutral tools or mechanisms. They are rather, they are also, in a sense, navigating very, very different visions of the future. And so therefore, we suggest that there should be critical social science scrutiny of these anticipation-focused activities. Who's involved? How are they conducted? And what is the purpose of these different anticipation activities? So in what are their implications for actions in the present? So that requires interdisciplinary research to some extent, bringing different social science communities at least together. And that's an important to train a lens on the politics of anticipation is what we try to do in our own work here. So the important questions that, in our view, need systematic study is not only the question that's it's a twin question of how are these processes and tools of anticipation actually being governed themselves. So in terms of how they are designed, who's involved, who has a seat at the table, whose visions are being incorporated into these processes, etc., but also how anticipation itself exercises governance effects. It shapes, it frames the object of governance, and therefore has certain implications for what sorts of, what types of governance become thinkable and doable, and what is taken off the table, perhaps. So another way to ask that question is whose visions that are implicated in these anticipatory processes, whose visions count, and how are specific visions of the future that might be implicit in various anticipation processes, how are they performative? How do they exercise steering effects? So that's the broad research agenda. And what I wanted to do today, to just make it a little more specific and to give an illustration of how we can look at these questions of the politics of anticipation and whose visions count, and what are the implications of multiple visions of the future and actions for the present. I thought I would look at one particular case that I've been researching recently, which is anticipatory governance of novel technologies, which are implicated in sustainability transformations, in imagining, for example, climate safe futures. What is the role of different types of technologies in steering towards climate safe futures, but what's the vision of a climate safe future as well? And in this instance, I'm looking at climate engineering as one particular novel set of technologies which might have a role to play in steering towards climate safe futures. But it's a very controversial issue, and there are many different views on whether, in fact, different types of climate engineering should have any role to play, whether it exacerbates climate impacted futures and the risks of climate impacted futures, or whether it's actually a way to mitigate some of the impacts, to ameliorate some of the impacts. So there are very different views on that. So how in the light of contestations about the need for climate engineering, different types of climate engineering, and how therefore these speculative novel technologies should be governed, how do we navigate that in devising governance arrangements in the present? So climate engineering, as some of you might be familiar with, encompasses a range of technologies, many of which are still largely speculative. They haven't been developed at scale. Some of them haven't even been tested or experimented with. But one general definition of climate engineering is the deliberate and the large-scale manipulation of the planetary environment in order to counter anthropogenic climate change. So it's deliberate and it's large-scale. And there are different types of climate engineering interventions possible, and this picture shows a whole bunch of them. And essentially, they get categorized as technologies or interventions that remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, that either suck it out through industrial means or some form of large-scale sequestration, terrestrial or otherwise. And the other set of technologies is not about carbon dioxide and its removal, but it's about the reflective capacity of basically reflecting some of the incoming sunlight back out into space, to have a cooling effect to counteract the warming effect of the greenhouse gas emissions. So not to target the emissions, but rather to target the radiative forcing of the Earth's upper atmosphere and the Earth's surface. So that's solar geoengineering, and that's what I'm going to be talking about. And one of the main ways of doing that is to inject sulfate aerosols into the upper atmosphere, into the stratosphere, essentially, which will reflect some of the incoming sunlight back out into space and therefore have a cooling effect. So these are very speculative technologies, and essentially I came into this space because I was invited in a couple of years ago to be part of a working group on climate engineering governance that brought people in who hadn't been talking about climate, researching climate engineering. They were climate governance scholars, but the ambition of this working group was to broaden the conversation, because it was a very small group of people debating this so far, social scientists and others. And the feeling was that this is a small group saying the same things again and again. So let's bring in a new group of people who can look at it with fresh eyes. And so in this context, what I realized when I started to read the growing body of literature, social science literature, on what are the governance challenges that solar radiation management or solar geoengineering poses, is that one dominant claim was that this is a largely ungoverned space. There are not yet formal governance arrangements in place, and therefore it's largely ungoverned. So much of the literature, it's growing in leaps and bounds, was about what kind of governance arrangements might be needed, should be put in place, what should be their design, where should governance be housed, what principles of governance should underpin future governance arrangements. So that was the kind of literature that was out there. And what, together with a colleague of mine, and I think you have this paper, that the article that you were given to read for this lecture, we, Ina Müller and I, said that, well, if we look at the literature actually, and we look what's happening in this space, we contest the idea that it's a wholly ungoverned space if we understand governance in a slightly broader way than just formal governance arrangements, because there is this growing body of literature, despite the fact that solar geoengineering is still very largely speculative. But if it is speculative, then an important question becomes whose speculations are actually shaping the contours of the climate engineering governance landscape, because ideas and speculations and imaginations are also performative, and they have the power to call into being specific realities. So we wanted to look at whose ideas are steering the landscape, and to question this notion that in fact it's an ungoverned space, because there are powerful ideas steering the governance landscape. So what we suggested in this article, De Facto Governance, how authoritative assessments construct climate engineering as an object of governance, we suggested that there is de facto governance of the landscape underway, and that authoritative assessments, expert reports on what the scope of the issue is, what do we know about a particular issue, what are the risks and impacts in the future, what could be the distributive consequences. So these sorts of reports, which are often seen as a neutral taking stock, here's the state of our knowledge. But we suggested that these kinds, and the IPCC, of course, is one type of authoritative assessment, but there were authoritative assessments being produced in the climate engineering space. And we wanted to look at these assessments as actually a source of steering or governance. So one of the reports we looked at was the Royal Society report, which came out in 2009. And it was one of the first to take stock of this space, the science, the governance, etc., around geoengineering the climate. And it was, Christina, if you could, I can't see my clock, so if you could give me an idea when I have about 10 minutes left, then that would be great for the 30 minutes. So this was produced soon after Paul Crutzen actually had a very seminal article in 2006, where he said that we actually need to pay some attention to climate engineering, and in particular to solar geoengineering as a potential way forward. And this kind of broke a taboo around this topic. So looking at this report, we suggested that in fact, this report has been very influential, not just in neutrally sort of mapping the state of knowledge, but legitimizing climate engineering as an important field for scientific inquiry, and going further than that by actually demarcating and categorizing climate engineering technologies, and therefore having certain consequences for how they should be governed. So as I said, some of these assessments are often seen as a source of neutral information, but what we suggested is that demarcation and categorization, which is what assessments often do, is actually a political act, because when you categorize, you make certain decisions about what to group with what, and you could also do it in different ways, and then that has certain consequences. Particular types of categorizations will then have particular ways of institutionalizing certain research communities, funding streams, etc. So this is what we then wanted to look at. We wanted to look at how an assessment is an intervention, and that intervention is in the form of a demarcation or a categorization, which then has steering effects, and usually those steering effects are in the form of normalizing and institutionalizing certain directions over others, certain governance directions. So what this report did is it categorized climate engineering technologies into carbon dioxide removal and solar radiation management. So what I'd also suggested, and this is of course one logical categorization, but there are other possible ways of categorizing the climate engineering landscape. You could also think about technologies which are used within territories versus in global commons, etc. You could think of other ways, things that are familiar versus not familiar. So there could be other ways of categorization. And the other move that this report made is to suggest that solar geoengineering is largely malign and CDR is largely benign. And this framing actually was very influential for a long time. It's only now, very recently, that there's a lot more debate about CDR and its potential risks, etc. Large-scale carbon dioxide removal and all of the multiple risks that come with that. So when we talk about whose visions count, we tried to come up with a systematic way to look at this idea of de facto governance. How can we study it? So to identify an intervention and then to identify the governance effects that flow from this intervention, which we said could normalize a field and institutionalize it. So then we had certain indicators for what normalizing might mean and what institutionalizing the field might mean. So for example, normalizing something would also cause a shift from questions of whether a particular technology is desirable, like whether and if questions, do we need it, should we do this, to questions of design, how and when and where, to sort of more, in a sense, more apolitical questions. And also institutionalizing the governance landscape by organizing research communities and sort of self-organize according to CDR or SRM, and funding streams also get organized. So these are certain de facto steering effects that have important consequences. So we looked at the Royal Society. You don't have to read all this. This is in the article, of course, but just to give an idea of how we went about looking at this. So then we looked at these indicators in the case of the Royal Society report, and we talked about this categorization, which was largely in Earth system parameters. You're talking about radiation versus emissions, rather than political jurisdiction or other ways of cutting the climate engineering pie. And then CDR was categorized in this report as slow, less cost effective, but potentially safer. And SRM was characterized as quick and affordable and effective, but with high risks. And all of these characterizations are now, of course, are debated and controversial, but this is how it was projected in this report. And this then had the kinds of consequences that I talked about, where the focus becomes on the how and the when, etc. And funding streams get allocated according to this demarcation. So this is one example. We also look at another authoritative assessment, which was the National Academy of Sciences of the US. And sorry, Christina, was that a message to me? No.
No, it is that we have like 3 questions. Perhaps you can address it.
Okay, I will look at that as soon as, yeah. So, so this is also something we talk about in the article, that there was this other authoritative assessment. So it's important what the US National Science Academy was saying, and it had this report in 2015. And again, it furthered the legitimization of climate engineering as an important field. So it's okay for mainstream scientists to study this. It's not a taboo anymore. And what this report then did is also attempted another demarcation of its own, which was to say that experimentation, which was very much debated, should there be, what kind of small scale or other types of experimentation should be permitted, if any. And what this report said is that if we can demarcate in it's possible to scientifically demarcate between small scale experimentation and deployment. And that's also a point of much debate, whether in fact there's a slippery slope from experimentation to deployment. So what this report tried to intervene into that politically contentious debate. So with that, that's what we were trying to show, that these authoritative assessments have these kinds of consequences, and they normalize and institutionalize what is in fact a rather speculative set of technologies, and they make it more thinkable, and therefore, and also shape the way in which these might get governed. And some of you, if you follow this issue, might be aware that the National Academy came out with another report just earlier this year. And this was also very much the latest salvo fired in this debate. And here there's another type of categorization is to suggest that solar geoengineering is simply a part of a portfolio of approaches. So this language of there's a portfolio of climate approaches, and this is one of those, is put forward in this. And of course, it's also calling for a research program that the US should undertake, and allocating $100 to $200 million for the next 5 years to do research on SRM. So it's really yet another impetus to normalizing research, including outdoor experimentation. So I think that's my take on the solar geoengineering example, but the broader implications of this is what we wanted to suggest is that one needs to conceptualize governance in a broader way to include these de facto forms of steering, which can have powerful consequences, and to ask who is putting forward these, who's behind authoritative assessments, etc. So whose visions are shaping the governance landscape. And even though de facto forms of steering are likely to be inevitable in anticipatory governance, especially also of novel technologies, but more generally, I mean, climate change as a whole is a issue requiring anticipatory governance. So this kind of de facto steering requires increased attention, and to ask the question whose visions count, because oftentimes these very many politically contested debates might get transferred into the realm of the technical, if it seems as if, well, you know, one has to look into the politics of expertise. So these are expert assessments, but what political positions are being articulated within these? And of course, we can go beyond authoritative assessments to also look at other types of sources of de facto steering, like modeling and foresight exercises, scenario building, etc., which are all very much proliferating now in different arenas, also because of the need to realize 1.5 and 2 degrees. So pathways, how are we going to realize those objectives? And so therefore, what do these scenarios actually call for? So this, I think I'm out of time, probably. I have no idea what time it actually is, but we have another, I think this was an optional reading. So for those who are interested in this topic, we also then tried to look at how also within the academic literature, how very different visions of climate impacted futures and the role for climate engineering in those are related to the very many governance proposals that are out there. So if there's a belief that actually we need to enable, what governance can also have very different objectives. If the goal of governance is to enable use of geoengineering, you have to design a different type of governance arrangement than if the goal is to restrict use of solar geoengineering. So we look at how, if you where you see the role of climate engineering, what implications that has for what kind of governance you think is needed in this space. And this is how we try to map different rationales for anticipatory governance in this space. So if you think you need to govern to enable solar geoengineering, you will propose certain types of governance proposals. If you, such as facilitating research, self-regulation, voluntary codes of conduct by scientists. If on the other end of the spectrum, you think you need to devise governance arrangements to restrict use of solar engineering, you will call for very different types of governance arrangements like bans and moratoria, etc. So what we tried to do is to say there's such a proliferation of governance proposals, but underlying those are very different visions of climate impacted futures and the role for climate engineering in those. So with that, I would like to just offer some points of discussion of food for thought in general for this field of study and Earth system governance and anticipatory governance in general, to ask the question of whose expertise counts and with what implications for the nature and directions of anticipatory governance, and also what is then the role of critical scholarship. So how can we train a lens on ourselves as well? Because how do we engage with these notions of, is our kind of scholarship also a form of de facto steering? What is the role for sort of a scholar activist in this space? So I think many of you young people are interested in, the relevance and the impact of research, and I think critical scholarship has a crucial role to play, even if it's not a how-to sort of checklist of policy relevance in the immediate short term. So with that, I see that there are some questions. I don't know.
Yeah.
Let me see.
Aarti, may I suggest perhaps they can go to the breakout rooms, and at the end, instead of each group having like 2 minutes, they would have 1 minute as you propose, and you can address the questions afterwards.
Yes, that sounds very good. Good suggestion, Christina. So what I had thought is that, we could have a little bit of time for you all to discuss with each other in breakout groups, just how the notion of de facto governance might be relevant for your own research. It could be in any area, but do you see instances of kind of the politics of expertise and de facto governance in your own research? And I thought it would be nice if in the groups, I think Jane is busy allocating you to groups. And if you could, towards the end of your discussion, just come up with one insight that you'd like to share in plenary and designate somebody to share it. Then when we come back, each group could share that one insight, just to get a little bit of discussion of how this is relevant for you. So with that, I hand over to Christina and Jane.
Yeah, I think that was us, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, so when it comes to the notion of de facto governance and anticipatory governance as such, so we discussed a little bit, and 2 of our group, well, 3 if we count Jane, were more working with bottom-up initiatives. So we were, so the insight was more, well, I guess it's more of a question of whether, and if so, how can anticipatory governance be made a little more participatory, or inclusive of other than expert knowledge, I guess. I think that's our take.
Thank you. Wow, that was efficient. So 2.
Maybe I could just ask a question back to group 1.
Yeah, sure.
Like you said, so you said that a lot of you were working on bottom-up initiatives. So I think what the example I was talking about is really about experts and how they have steered, an example of an expert form of de facto governance. But you could also see how bottom-up initiatives might steer a landscape which is as yet not governed in a formal way, right? So it doesn't have to be experts. And therefore, it could be there can be different sources of de facto governance. So what would your reaction be to that? Do you see examples of that perhaps?
Well, I don't know if someone else from the group wants to add something to that, but from my point of view, I guess it's so with the bottom-up initiatives, I see what you mean, that it can be experts, but it also can be anyone else. I guess it's a little difficult for a lot of other communities to actually engage in a de facto governance. I think especially because of the kind of, I'm not sure how to frame that, or at least that's what's coming out of my research so far. But yeah, that it's a little difficult because the different communities don't necessarily feel like they have the expertise, I guess, or the abilities to actually do this kind of thing. I'm not sure if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you. I think just generally, I think it would be good to think about maybe as research agendas for, to think about other actors, powerful actors or others, or, not just states or scientists, but you could think of technology developers like blockchain developers or other types of, whose the way they speak about speculative technologies actually suggests that something is possible when, and there is promise associated with some set of technologies or not. That can also, and if those views get airing, and that get traction in the political process, or financial actors or others. But let's move to the next group then.
I think I was in group 2. I'm not entirely sure, but I think so. So if no one else stands up, okay, good. So my group was together with Rodrigo and Chandra.
Should I stop? Sorry, should I stop sharing my screen? Then I can maybe see people? Yeah.
Sure, yeah.
Oh, that's much better. Okay. Okay,
And
now
Shahana, so Shahana, Rodrigo, and Chandra and me. And both Rodrigo and my work relates to the SDGs, and we discussed a bit, and I'm not sure if it's a proper example of de facto governance, but how the setting of SDG indicators was done mostly by statistical experts and not so much a political process. And actually the indicators in the end are very important in steering policies in different countries. You could say that almost indicators are more important for what policies are made than the overarching goals. So they might, I'm not sure if it's de facto governance or more like hidden governance almost, but it's one thing we discussed. And we actually had the same question as a previous group, whether these anticipatory processes are inclusive, the anticipatory processes are participatory, and whether de facto governance is also in non-technical terms. So we already discussed that a bit. So that's it from our group, I think.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. Yeah, no, that's of course, the use of statistics and indicators. These are also, very much sites for critical research in some sense to see what, how they are designed, what implications they have and what they include and what they don't. So I think that's very much an insight. And I think generally it's true that anticipatory processes at the moment around new technologies or new sort of governance arrangements do tend to be expert heavy in some sense. So there is, and so I think there was also a question in the chat about how beyond just highlighting their political nature, what can we do? So maybe I'll comment on that towards the end, but yeah, thank you. And then let's move to the other group, the next group.
This is the group of Mario, Natalia, Rebecca, and Sharon.
I don't know, maybe I just start and then you add if I missed something. Yeah, we actually, we exchanged more about what we do research on than on the question. But if I reflect briefly on what we were talking about, I think there's some some sort of relevance of de facto governance in all of our research topics. So we are talking about governance networks in urban settings and in rural settings. We were talking about governance, or the coherence of governance of different levels in China in particular, and also on how does Natalia, please help me.
Yes, we were talking about our researches and what we are doing. So it was this kind of conversation.
Okay, yeah, no, but it's it's interesting to reflect on, what could there be an element of is there an anticipatory element in your research? And then is there, if that is the case, are there sort of sites of de facto governance, which could be expert driven, which could be exclusionary, but still have political consequences, or maybe they're not exclusionary. So that kind of thing is useful to reflect on, I think. Okay, thanks. And then we have 2 more groups, Gupta? Or?
Yeah, so we have Cynthia, Hannah, and Liliana in the next group.
So our group, we have one, so my research was about market industry transitions, and Hannah's research is about business transitions as well, and EU policy. We found in those 2 cases, we could see evidence perhaps of de facto governance in terms of like whose experiences get integrated into like a narrative that starts to form about the transition that's happening. And like, then, okay, so that was that. And then in Cynthia's case, the case that she's studying seems to be a really fragmented situation. So there are different levels of like actual government, and they're so fragmented, so there isn't really any collective action that comes up through that. So we kind of wondered, like, is that almost a form of governance? Like, is it kept so fragmented so that a certain situation is kept as kind of the status quo? But that's what we thought might be de facto governance in our cases.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I see that we've run out of time, but I do want the last group, but I think that's also fascinating what you talk about, the question of, whether fragmented governance arenas are also, they are of course shaping the landscape in some way. So, what nodes in fragmented governance arenas are the more powerful ones would be an important question. But let's go to the final group and hear from them.
Sure. So our group, we talked a little bit about, one question that we had was, how do you differentiate, or I guess, how do you connect or overlap de facto government with informal governance arrangements and processes, and whether those deserve to be considered kind of separate conditions, or if we should just consider that as kind of expectations of forms of governance. And we also had a short discussion about how it seems like a lot of the anticipatory climate work has a significant dependence on the role of technology as solutions, and kind of what other processes should we consider besides just kind of, innovating on the scale of the technology itself.
Yeah, that's great. And I think that's a good question about like clarifying distinctions between informal, formal, and de facto governance. And that was something that where we had, so in the article, we defined de facto, we said that it's unacknowledged forms of steering. So you have a lot of, there's of course, there's a lot of informal governance, which could be voluntary, steered by private actors. So a lot of, NGO initiatives or corporate voluntary reporting, etc. That's all informal forms of governance, but it's intended to govern. right there. It has a clearly identified objective. And so a de facto is not, it's unacknowledged forms of steering. It's not like this authoritative assessment said we're going to govern this space in this manner, but it exercises steering effects, and the steering effects manifest in, you know that you can view it as governance because of the effects that are manifested. So that's kind of how we distinguish between de facto and informal. And I see we've run out of time, but I wanted to make one comment. I don't know what happens next in the program, so maybe this is disruptive, but should I say something about the questions or?
Yes, please, just make it short. At least.
Yeah, okay. So I think there were in the chat, basically there was one set of questions around the distinctions between anticipatory governance, adaptive governance, and reflexive governance. And then there was another question about, well, what can we as researchers do about, in addition to showing how de facto governance might have political consequences, what can we do about intervening and to make them more inclusive, etc. So I think with the first question, I think anticipatory governance is sort of this umbrella concept which has adaptive governance elements, and it should also be reflexive, but it's also about devising governance arrangements in the present to address something that hasn't quite manifested yet. Whereas adaptive governance is an established sort of field of, subfield of governance, which is about, well, how do governance arrangements adapt to uncertainties and continually evolve? And so that's some amount of stability versus openness to change and adaptive capacity. So I think that's a quite specific thing, whereas an anticipatory governance, I think, would be a more of an umbrella concept where there's a need perhaps for adaptiveness of governance arrangements, but also not just incremental adaptiveness, but also sort of the potential to realize wholly, unknown futures, etc. So that would be my quick take on that. And then about what we should do, I think perhaps it's not necessarily possible always to intervene into existing sources of de facto governance and to make them, have different political implications. But I think it would be important for also to have alternative sites of expertise. So if it's about expert sources of governance, then we as experts in our own right should then advance our own perspectives, and then try to ensure that those perspectives get some political traction. So that would be my take to, I don't know who asked that question, but it was a very good question. And I think that's also something that we continually, I think it was Katinka maybe. Yeah. So that's something to continually grapple with in our own work. But with that, I will stop. Thank you very much for the attention, and thank you, Christina, Gustav, and Jane for this. And I hand back to you.
Thank you, a heartfelt thank you for Aarti. It was so interesting. Clap your hands.